Some cars are designed to turn heads. This one wasn't. This one was designed, quite deliberately, to be ordinary. And that decision is exactly what turned it into one of the most successful vehicles in automotive history. This is the story of the Renault 12. A car nobody expected to be remembered. A car built to be forgettable on purpose. And a car that ended up on roads in more countries, under more names, for longer than almost anything else built in its era. Stick with me, because by the end of this, ordinary is going to sound like the smartest strategy in the entire car industry. Let's go back to January of 1964. Inside Renault's styling center in France, a new project quietly got underway. Internally, it carried the code name Project 117. Its job was simple to describe and brutally hard to actually deliver. Renault needed something to sit between two very different cars already in its lineup, the small, humble Renault 8 and the bigger, more sophisticated Renault 16. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. The brief for this new car wasn't about excitement. It wasn't about pushing boundaries. According to Renault's own account of the project, the car had to be economical, not particularly sophisticated, roomy inside, with a decent boot, and a modest engine would do just fine. It had to be simple enough to build almost anywhere on Earth. It had to survive rough export markets, while still feeling comfortable enough for French buyers at home. And it had to work as a foundation that could be reshaped into all kinds of different variants down the line. In other words, Renault wasn't trying to build a masterpiece. They were trying to build a workhorse. And workhorses, as this story is about to prove, can end up going a lot further than anyone expects. There's a small design detail worth knowing here too. Some of the earliest concept sketches for what eventually became the Renault 16 actually looked closer to what the 12 would end up being than to the finished 16 itself. In other words, this ordinary little car and Renault's more ambitious, more celebrated hatchback shared roots that went back to the very same drawing boards, even though history remembers them so differently today. Pay attention to this next detail, because it's the kind of thing that separates a genuinely clever engineering decision from just a cheap one. The Renault 12 was front-wheel drive, just like its stablemates, the Renault 4 and the Renault 16. But underneath, it worked completely differently from both of them. On those other two cars, the engine sat behind the front wheels, mounted transversely, sideways across the engine bay. On the 12, Renault flipped that layout around. The engine sat longitudinally, lined up front to back, ahead of the front wheels entirely. That single decision had a ripple effect through the whole car. Because the engine was positioned differently, the gear selector could be mounted simply on the floor of the cabin, rather than sprouting awkwardly from the dashboard like on the Renault 4, or hanging off the steering column like on the Renault 16. At the back, instead of a costly, complex independent suspension setup, Renault fitted a simpler, lighter, rigid rear axle. None of this was about cutting corners just to save money, although it certainly did that too. It was about building something that factories all over the world, from experienced operations to brand new ones with limited expertise, could actually assemble reliably, using simpler tooling and simpler mechanical layouts. A sophisticated car is often a fragile one to manufacture at scale. Renault understood that trade-off from day one, and it's the single biggest reason this humble little saloon was about to travel further than almost anything else Renault ever built. Even the engine itself leaned on proven ground rather than anything experimental. It was a cast-iron unit that traced its roots back to 1962, first used in the Renault 8 and Renault 10, simply enlarged for its new job under the bonnet of the 12. Old, trusted, easy to service with basic tools, in basically any corner of the world. The Renault 12 finally made its public debut in October of 1969 at the Paris Motor Show. At launch, buyers could choose between two trim levels, the basic L and the slightly more equipped TL, both fitted with a 1,289 cubic centimeter engine, producing around 54 horsepower. A year later, in 1970, Renault expanded the range further with a practical estate wagon and, more surprisingly, a genuinely sporty Gordini performance version, which we'll come back to shortly, because it's a far bigger story than most people realize. Here's where things get interesting and a little contradictory. In Europe, the reception was warm. The press praised the spacious, comfortable cabin, the confident styling, decent performance for the class, and genuinely low fuel consumption. For a car built on a keep it simple brief, it didn't feel cheap or unpleasant to actually live with. But pay close attention here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets quietly left out of most retrospectives. When American magazine Road and Track tested a 1974 model, they were considerably less impressed. They singled out the engine's noise as intrusive and were blunt about the heavy, non-power steering, calling it a serious design flaw outright. The ventilation system didn't fare much better in their eyes either. So here's the honest picture. This wasn't a universally beloved masterpiece. It had real, documented shortcomings, especially by the standards of a market like the United States. And yet somehow, that didn't stop this car from becoming one of the most widely built vehicles on the entire planet. What comes next is the part almost nobody outside of serious car history circles has ever heard. Renault kept tweaking the range as the years went on too. A milder TS trim joined the lineup in 1972, and from 1974 through 1975, buyers could even get an automatic gearbox option on a version called the TR. Then, in the summer of 1975, a major facelift arrived, bringing new bumpers and updated lighting across the range. Though the Gordini performance version quietly disappeared from the lineup at that same point, here's where this story stops being about one car in one country and starts being about something a lot bigger. That deliberately simple engineering, remember, the one designed specifically to be built almost anywhere, meant Renault could license and locally assemble the 12 in an almost absurd number of countries. Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Morocco, New Zealand, Portugal, Romania, Spain, Turkey, Yugoslavia, Venezuela. That's not a typo, and that's not an exaggerated list for effect. That is the genuine, documented spread of countries that built their own version of this ordinary little Renault. Plants ran from Santa Isabel in Argentina to Bursa in Turkey, from Valladolid in Spain to a facility in Thames, New Zealand, each one turning out locally built versions for their own domestic markets, often for years longer than France itself kept building the original. This is exactly the kind of story that this channel exists to dig into. The vehicles that quietly reshaped entire regions of the world without ever becoming a household name everywhere at once. If you're enjoying learning the real story behind cars like this, now's a great moment to hit subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. And down in the comments, I'd love to know, had you ever heard of the Renault 12 before this video, or is this the first time its name has crossed your radar? Drop a comment, hit like if this is teaching you something new, and share it with a friend who'd get a kick out of this kind of story. And it wasn't even always sold under the same name. In Australia, at various points, it wore the badges Renault 1.4 litre and Renault Virage. In Turkey, it became the Renault 12 Toros. Same car underneath, wearing a different identity depending on which showroom you happen to be standing in. Romania. In the mid-1960s, Romania's government wanted to build a genuine domestic car industry from almost nothing. According to Renault's own account of the deal, it was reportedly the country's leader at the time, Nicolae Ceausescu himself, who pushed hardest for an agreement with a Western manufacturer. Renault won the licensing contract, and the car chosen to become Romania's very own people's car was, of course, this same Renault 12. The timing wasn't left to chance either. The first Dacia 1300, as it was renamed locally, rolled off the assembly line at the newly built factory in Mioveni on the 23rd of August, 1969, deliberately timed to coincide with Romania's National Day. What happened next is genuinely staggering. By the middle of the 1970s, the Dacia 1300 had captured more than half of the entire Romanian domestic car market. Over a production run stretching 35 years, From 1969 all the way through 2004, roughly 2 million units were built, widely exported across Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. A commercial pickup version, built on the very same underlying platform, kept going even longer, all the way until December of 2006. Think about that for a second. A car quietly retired and forgotten in its home country of France was still rolling off assembly lines, virtually unchanged in its bones, decades later, on the other side of the continent. Locals came to know it simply as the people's car, an affordable, dependable machine tough enough to handle harsh winters and rough roads far better than most of its Western contemporaries. But Romania wasn't even the last surprise in this story. Here's a detail that even a lot of dedicated car enthusiasts have never come across. In the late 1960s, Ford acquired a factory and the manufacturing rights to a closely related Renault design over in Brazil. And here's the twist that makes this genuinely wild. That car, launched under the name Ford Corcel, actually reached Brazilian dealerships before the Renault 12 had even made its debut back in France. Under a completely different badge, in a completely different hemisphere, a close cousin of this same humble engineering was already on sale to the public. The Corcel went on to become a huge, long-running success in Brazil, staying in local production for well over a decade before evolving into another model, the Ford Del Rey, which continued selling strongly into the early 1990s. Two entirely different manufacturer badges, Renault in Europe and much of the world, Ford in Brazil, both quietly benefiting from engineering that traced back to the exact same design philosophy, being deliberately simple, roomy, and easy to produce at scale. That's the real, hidden shape of this car's success. It wasn't one company, one badge, or one country. It was an entire family of vehicles, spread across continents, sold under names that most drivers never realized were connected at all. But there's still one more side to this story, and it might be the one that surprises you the most. Because this ordinary family car had a genuinely serious competitive streak hiding underneath its unassuming skin. In 1971, Renault introduced a genuinely fast version of the 12, badged the Gordini, following in the footsteps of the earlier, much-loved Renault 8 Gordini that had built the performance badge's reputation in the years before. Finished in a distinctive blue livery with white racing stripes running the length of the body, it packed a 1.6-liter engine putting out around 115 horsepower, fed through a standard 5-speed gearbox at a time when many rivals still made do with 4, enough to push the car to a genuine top speed of about 115 miles an hour. For a family saloon built on a keep it cheap and simple brief, that's a seriously impressive number for its time. Renault Australia ran a full works rally program with the Gordini, campaigned by rally champion Bob Watson against Holden's own factory-backed rally team, one of the fiercest rivalries in Australian motorsport at the time. The Gordini also made an appearance on one of the most punishing events in the entire sport, the East African Safari Rally, in 1972, tackling brutal terrain against the world's best rally crews. This wasn't some badge-engineered marketing gimmick either. It was a genuine, homologated, factory-backed racing program built around the bones of a car that was never supposed to be exciting in the first place. So let's pull all of this together now, because the full scale of what this ordinary little car actually achieved is bigger than almost anyone realizes. Even most people who consider themselves serious car enthusiasts. Renault itself sold roughly 2.5 million units of the 12 worldwide under its own badge. Add in the nearly 2 million Dacia badged versions built in Romania, plus everything assembled under license across Argentina, Turkey, Colombia, and every other country on that long list from earlier, and you're looking at a combined production run that puts this humble little saloon among the most built car platforms of the entire 20th century. Production in France itself wound down in 1980, barely more than a decade after launch, quietly discontinued and largely forgotten in its own homeland. But the very last Renault 12, badged for the Turkish market, wasn't built until the year 2000. and its Romanian descendant, in updated Dacia 1310 form, kept rolling off the line until 2004, with the pickup variant surviving all the way to the end of 2006. Here's the real gut punch of this entire story, if you sit with it for a second. This car was never meant to be remembered. It was built to be cheap, practical, and forgettable. A workhorse designed for a job, not a legacy. And it ended up motorizing entire nations, decades after France itself had already moved on and stopped thinking about it. The very qualities that made it unremarkable at home, simplicity, durability, ease of manufacture, are the exact same qualities that let it quietly outlast almost every flashier, more celebrated rival from its era. Think about how many far more famous, far more glamorous cars from the same period never got anywhere close to that kind of reach, never got built on 5 different continents, never motorized entire nations from the ground up. This unassuming little saloon did exactly that, almost by accident, simply by refusing to be complicated. Sometimes the loudest, most exciting car in the room isn't the one that ends up changing the world. Sometimes it's the quiet one, built to just get the job done, that goes the furthest of all. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. You don't need to be the flashiest, the fastest, or the most talked about to leave the biggest mark. The Renault 12 proves that sometimes being reliable, adaptable, and genuinely useful, over and over again, in country after country, beats being exciting for a single headline moment. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't beloved everywhere it went, but it showed up, it did the job, and it kept doing that job for decades, after everyone assumed its story was already over. That's a lesson that applies well beyond the automotive world, if you think about it honestly. If you've ever owned a Renault of your own, or a car built on foreign underpinnings you never fully knew the story behind, there's a decent chance it carried more hidden history than you ever realized. Most of us never stop to think about where the engineering under our feet actually came from. But now you know this one. Now, next time somebody brings up a Dacia, or a Ford Corcel, or an old Renault badge from a market you've never visited, you've got a piece of the real story connecting it all together. If this taught you something new today, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, so this channel can keep bringing you the real stories behind the cars that quietly shaped the world, the ones that never got the spotlight they probably deserved. Drop a comment and tell me which part surprised you most, whether it's the Brazilian Ford connection, or the fact that this car outlived its own homeland by over 2 decades. Hit like if you enjoyed this one, and if you know somebody who'd appreciate a story like this, an old Renault owner, a gearhead friend, anybody who loves this kind of hidden history, send it their way. There are more stories like this one coming, the cars that never asked for credit but earned it anyway. I'll see you in the next one.